Hello, I'm Anultus, and today I'm going to give out some basic ideas on the periodization of history. I repeat, the periodization of history, or the putting history into periods. And when I say periods, what specifically do I mean? I mean specific lengths of time that clearly divide different parts of history into different segments, usually for the purpose of being able to study history in in a consistent manner, and to be able to divide the study of history into various studies. For example, modern history, medieval history, ancient history. So I'm going to put out a few terms here. Okay, let's use a slightly larger font. Come on. Come on. It's being slow. I don't know why Paint is being slow. Of all programs, I did not expect Paint to be slow on being able to change the font. Okay, there we are. Oh, here it goes again. No, no. This is painful. Oh well. We'll just it's not responding. How I was here planning to make a video and then suddenly nothing works. Oh well, I guess that happens. Anyway, so let's go with a periodization based on material cultures. For example, you've got the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and of course the Iron Age, and after that, this is of course relating to Mediterranean cultures. It is different depending on various parts of the world because technology develops differently in different parts of the world, and you can have Stone Age civilizations that have many technological aspects similar to that of Iron Age civilizations in other places in the world. In additionally, of course, you can have Stone Age cultures living side by side with Iron Age cultures and Bronze Age cultures, perhaps due to a scarcity of resources or poverty or a number of various reasons why a Stone Age culture might not have access to extensive bronze or iron tools. Anyway, we've got classical and medieval and modern. Those are generally some categorizations of history. Now, it is notable that what people call antiquity or ancient times refers usually to a historical period which goes from up to the boundary between classical antiquity and the Middle Ages, back to whenever history is first recorded. And depending on which part of the world you're in, this is different. Now, of course, there's also prehistory, which is a way to categorize things that happened in the past before history itself. And the reason why things are not recorded is, of course, maybe the culture did not have either the technology or the oral traditions to pass down a historical record, even though the culture may have advanced technologically to perhaps even Iron Age levels. You can really see the difference there. Now, the classical era, of course, is different in length, as I said earlier, between various different cultures. For example, the Mayan classical era is different from that of the Mediterranean and the Near East. And the way we can usually divide these various groups or ages of history is via the use of transitions between them. Now, the transition between Iron Age and Classical Age is very vague because there definitely is an overlap. So I can't really say that there's a good place to transition there. Not a lot of people like to say let's say put 500 BC as a rounded date of about that, or back in time to a point when maybe more sophisticated empires and philosophers started appearing, but really there isn't the change from the Iron Age to the Classical Age, if you consider them distinct, is really gradual in many cases. Now, the Stone Age to the Bronze Age is very simple, as is the Bronze to the Iron Age, although a lot of people can oversimplify it. So, of course, the three ages here, stone, bronze, and iron, are based on the technology and the types of tools that are used by a culture, and classification of a lot of prehistoric cultures divides them into Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and some cultures in recorded history as well fall under these divisions. Now, the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, essentially, the difference is the widespread use of bronze for tools and weapons and other things. And a lot of times there is a transition here called the Chalcolithic era. I'm actually going to put this down here for convenience, and I'm just going to do this. So this is the transitional period between the Stone and Bronze Age in many places. The Chalcolithic era is a cultural stage when civilizations learn to smelt simple metals like copper, gold, silver, lead, and such things, but they haven't combined the copper with arsenic or with tin in order to produce bronze. Therefore, they are in a stage where they don't have the solid bronze, which they really need to get those harder tools that are necessary for a civilization to be considered a Bronze Age civilization. However, they do have begun metallurgy. Now, the Stone Age itself is often divided into the Neolithic, Mesolithic, and Paleolithic. And these three ages really, the real difference between them is the kinds of technology used. Now, Neolithic, you start having cities being built and big monuments and stuff. However, it is worth noting that the chronology in prehistorical times is very... It's not a very clear thing. So in many cases, you have cultures that are Paleolithic living maybe in the same area as a culture that's Chalcolithic or something, where maybe they're just really poor and they don't have the same things as the others do. So what I'm trying to say here is that it's not always an easy path that you can just say a culture advances from Paleolithic, then Mesolithic, then Neolithic, then Chalcolithic, then Bronze Age, Iron Age, Classical era, Medieval era, Modern era, then Postmodern, if you like to put that in there. it's not something that's clear like that. Now, so the advancement to Bronze Age really can be shown by the use of bronze tools. Now, the advancement to the Iron Age is a lot less uh, a lot less clear cut, because iron was actually used in a lot of Bronze Age cultures. It just wasn't used as extensively as bronze. So the actual advancement from a Bronze Age to an Iron Age, well, as again, advancement isn't always the right word, because sometimes in some situations using bronze is better than using iron. But the transition from the Bronze Age to an Iron Age usually involves iron becoming more popular for use as tools and weapons than bronze. And a major time period when this happened is the Bronze Age collapse, at least in the Mediterranean and Near East area. Bronze Age collapse. In which several civilizations were heavily affected by various attacks from a number of other cultures, and there's also natural disasters and political unrest occurring, and that's what happened with the Bronze Age collapse. And the exact causes of it in relation to whether it has more to do with raiding by the so-called sea peoples or with natural disasters and crop shortages is really a subject of debate. But generally, what historians can agree with is that many of these cultures primarily used bronze before the Bronze Age collapse, and then primarily used iron after the Bronze Age collapse, possibly due to bronze becoming more expensive or new techniques being used in iron working. But that's generally the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Iron to classical, again, as I said earlier, it's really an arbitrary thing. You can put it maybe at 500 BC, 600 BC, 400 BC. It's not actually that important, because some people would say, well, why don't we have a Steel Age? And the reason people don't have a Steel Age when looking at these things is because steel is more a gradient kind of metal, in the sense that steel generally historically has to do with how much carbon you put into the iron, you put in with the iron, and maybe you add in some other metals in there, like manganese as well, and that's how you create steel. But how how steel-like metals are that are used for tools, weapons, and armor really depended, especially in the classical era, on where it was being made. So, for example, places such as Noricum, was which was eventually very important to the Romans, had very high quality iron that had good carbon content, and therefore made tools that were considerably more steel-like than those of other regions. And so the transition from iron to steel isn't really a clear division there, because it's a gradient of how much because steel is a very undefined thing, is what I'm trying to say. It's a gradient of how much carbon you have in there, and whether you combine it with other metals as well. So there can be iron that's very steel-like, or steel that's very iron-like, because steel isn't its own it isn't its own element, and it also, of course, isn't a very well defined type of alloy. But the division from classical to medieval in European history, and why do I talk about European history? It may sound a bit Eurocentric to a lot of people. And the truth about whether or not history should or shouldn't be Eurocentric is that regardless of how Eurocentric you think history should be, it still is important to realize that European history is important globally, in the sense that the events that happened that shaped Europe throughout the classical and medieval eras eventually went on to uh, butterfly effect into the rest of the world throughout the colonial era and throughout the times of the Great Game, the Scramble for Africa, the World Wars. European history is very important to the entire world, is what I'm trying to say. So these divisions that specifically apply to European history, a lot more than maybe to history in some other places, are very important. So anyway, classical to medieval, usually a dividing point there is the collapse of the Roman Empire, or at least the Western Roman Empire, because the Eastern Roman Empire managed to survive toward the end of the medieval era. And another thing to note about the Roman Empire, just as a side note, is that the Roman Empire, you can't really consider it as an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire, but more as the eastern part of the Roman Empire and the western part of the Roman Empire, because it technically was still one state that just happened to have two governments that ruled two separate parts of it. And at many points in its history, the Roman Empire actually had more than two governments. It had many different ones that maybe ruled various parts of the empire, especially in times of turmoil, when it was difficult for one emperor to either control the entire empire or to exercise control in the entire empire. The difference being that an emperor may have voluntarily divided the empire in order to make it easier to govern, or an emperor may have involuntarily had lost control of parts of the empire, wherein those parts chose their own emperors who were believed to either appeal more to the local interests or perhaps be superior on an imperial, on a grand national scale to the previous emperor. But anyway, a great way to define the real division in European history from classical to medieval is, of course, the migration period, which is heavily involved with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And for those of you who don't know, the migration period essentially is a period in European history where there was a lot of population movements, where many Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine, or they crossed the Danube and settled in areas that previously were ruled by Latin-speaking populations. And then many of these Germanic peoples adopted Latin languages, or well, actually, I think within the confines of a former Roman Empire, for the most part, Latin-based languages became the norm, with the exception of course, Great Britain, where the Saxons and the Angles and other groups went in there, and their linguistic their linguistic heritage managed to more strongly influence the local groups than that of the Latin culture in the region. Speaking of which, eventually the previous inhabitants of a land, the Britons, went and they didn't speak Latin either, and that's where we get Welsh, which is, I suppose, based off of their ancestral language. And of course, this is also a time period where Slavs started to expand into various parts of Europe. So you've got the Poles and the Serbs and the Bulgarians, all of which are important, and also the Scythians by this point in time had become a lot less influential and were eventually replaced by other groups in European history. Now, of course, during the Middle East in this time, the Persia was ruled by the Sassanids, and shortly after the migration period would come in Arabia the rise of Islam. And of course, in the early medieval period also, you've got the rise of the Franks, and also Judaism surprisingly manages to spread into some parts of Arabia and the Caucasus and Ethiopia. And however, in many of these areas, it later becomes heavily pushed out by Islam, which then spreads into those areas as well. And also, Ethiopia eventually becomes cut off from the rest of the Christian world. And anyway, a lot of stuff happens. But that's generally where the medieval period comes from. And medieval, of course, refers to the Middle Ages, as they're called, in reference to the modern times being today, the Middle Ages being in the middle of history, and antiquity being the time before the Middle Ages. Now, of course, the medieval to modern transition comes in a few different things, such as exploration, the age of exploration, in reference to European history, where explorers started to go around from Europe looking for new trade routes in order to reach trading partners that were beyond the Middle East, so that they could circumvent people like the Ottomans in acquiring better trade deals. And that's why people sailed around Africa and went across the Atlantic Ocean. And then, of course, colonization is a very interesting part of that history, where, for example, in North and South America and the Caribbean, the European explorers find cultures that have less powerful weapons, and they decide that this is a good climate to maybe raise some crops and to really make some money. So they start colonizing those areas. And of course, another part in the transition from medieval to modern is the Renaissance. I think I may have misspelled it, but oh well. Or Renaissance is a time where it's a rebirth, where the people living during this time, this transition from medieval to modern, they look back at the classical era, and the great philosophers and the scientists of the classical era, and they decide that maybe it's good to re-examine some of those ideas. And they don't only look at the philosophers and the scientists; they also look at the theologians, the ancient theologians. That is especially in Europe for the Christian theologians, and then you have the Reformation, which in which the authority that the Pope had beginning in the early medieval era and then really becoming stripped down during the Protestant Reformation, and a general skepticism of the papal authority and of the authority of not simply the religious institutions, but also of some of the political institutions, such as we see with people like Thomas Müntzer, who led in the peasants' rebellion in Germany. So it really was an age of transition where people decided to really expand the scope of their ambitions to beyond Europe, and to also re-examine ancient texts and to question the institutions of their day. So that eventually led to the modern era, and modern having the word mode in it, which such as fashion, you see, where well, anyway, we can talk about what the modern era exactly is at another time, and whether or not it has ended and there's a postmodern era. That's another thing. But other big transitions in history would be the nuclear age, where nuclear weaponry and nuclear power are becoming viable. And of course, nuclear weaponry and nuclear power really ups the ante on how things are. And anyway, there's a lot of different things, but essentially my point throughout the whole thing is that history can be divided into various parts, and I really find it interesting to look at how societies change throughout history, because another thing to remember here is that that societies weren't constant throughout the classical era. They weren't constant throughout the Middle Ages. There was a lot of innovation during the Middle Ages, so really calling it the Dark Ages is a little bit of a misnomer, because there was a lot of innovation, a lot of technological advancement, especially in Europe during this time, as well as the Middle East and in China. China also has its own periodization, and periodization can also be specific to a nation. For example, the dynasties of China, or the various shogunates of Japan, or the dynasties of England. So it's a very interesting thing to look at history and to look at how things changed over time, because more than showing us that history is constant, these periodizations show us how things change over time, especially in related to technology and society, and how people look at themselves and look at the institutions. And just as a final note, I'd like to say that war always changes. Thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time. And I will toss over and out.